Hey, good morning, and glad you made it through the rain. It's raining out there, isn't it? And while it's kind of a dismal day out there weather-wise, we have had a blast this weekend. An awesome service earlier today, and I know God's going to make this one the same, and He already has given us a great time. We're in a series, as Pastor Matt mentioned, from the book of Ecclesiastes. We're looking at the life of a man who was on a journey. Now, for those of you who may not have caught last week, let me just do a little bit of review. This man, Solomon, God inspired him to write 3 books that are in our Bible. The first one, I believe he wrote when he was a young man. It's called the Song of Solomon. It's an incredible love poem celebrating the joys of intimacy in marriage. And it's sometimes called the Song of Songs, and he wrote it early in his life, newly married, when he was first discovering the joys of romance and love. The second book attributed to Solomon is the book of Proverbs. Now, he didn't write all the Proverbs in there. Some of them were written by other authors, but he wrote most of them and compiled the others together. I believe it was written sort of in the middle of his life as he was launching his own children and other young people into life, into adulthood. And here's the point of the book of Proverbs, in case you're studying the Bible or trying to discover this. The point is, look, life is too short to make all the mistakes yourself. You need to rely on the wisdom of others, what they've experienced in life. And so it's sort of a distillation of wisdom, and don't live life by trial and error. There's so many pitfalls out there. Listen, others have fallen in them. Don't you do the same. Learn from the mistakes of others. But then this third book we call Ecclesiastes was written toward the end of his life, and I need you to know he's a rather depressed man. He has drifted from God. He is on a journey where he has kind of lost contact with all of his earlier life, and he's forgotten a lot of the wisdom he had, or is choosing to ignore it. And he is discovering that when you have a vacuum in your soul, you do almost anything to try to fill that vacuum. And so that's exactly what he's doing as he searches for a meaningful, satisfying life. So today, I want us to take a look at that. It's found in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, where he just outlines a lot of the things that he searched in, and he tells us both where and how he searched for meaning in life. The first place he searched is in what you could just call pleasure. Pleasure. I pick it up in chapter 2, verse 1. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. And then Solomon mentions at least 3 areas that he searched in to try to find that satisfying, pleasurable experience. The first one I'll call comedy. He uses the word laughter here, but I've used the word comedy to sum up all that he says. Verse 2, laughter, I said, is foolish, and what does pleasure accomplish? Now, if you're a curious Bible student, I would urge you to do a little study on your own sometime of the places that laughter is used in the book of Ecclesiastes. It makes an interesting study because laughter is sort of a micro theme in the book. I think you'll be intrigued by what you find this book says about laughter. But the idea here is he's trying to amuse himself. He no doubt has his court jester, as so many other kings have had. And he's got all these people around him to try to bring a smile on his face. He goes on in verse 8, I acquired men and women singers. Now, I don't know about you, but I love live music. I know many of you do as well. There's few things like the experience of just being a part of a concert, someplace where men and women are playing and singing live music, and you're a part of that experience. Well, here's what's going on in this case. Solomon is somewhat of a Renaissance man. As we're going to see, he's gifted in so many areas, and this is going to blow your mind, but he wrote 1,005 songs. That's quite a repertoire of songs. And I believe probably these live singers probably had put some of his lyrics to music, and they're actually performing them there for the king. And the idea here is that he's trying to build around him a world that keeps him occupied. As someone might say, he is amusing himself to death. Secondly, he pursued pleasure in wine. Now, alcohol throughout the ages has been the preferred medication of many people who are going through a depression. But sadly, they often find that when they drink to excess, it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't bring them the mirth and the happiness they're looking for. Instead, it actually contributes to their depression and their downward spiral. Verse 3, I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. 2 Chronicles chapter 2 tells us about the amount of wine that Solomon once gave away. It says he gave away 20,000 baths of wine. Bath is an ancient metric. It doesn't mean 20,000 bathtub equivalent today. But here's what he gave away: 115,000 gallons of fine wine. You say, who did he give it to? He gave it to the woodcutters from Lebanon who brought the finest cedar wood down to help him build the temple and later to build his own personal palace. The wine was a part of their payment. So get the picture here. Solomon has available to him the finest wines in the land, and he tried cheering himself with wine, he says. And then he talks about the pleasure of women. Now remember, here's a man who's drifted far from God, who is seeking in any way he can to fill the vacuum in his soul. Verse 8 goes on, and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. He says, look, I had this huge number of women available to me. Last week we saw he married 700 wives. You think, is this guy losing his mind? Well, as we noted, most of those were simply diplomatic arrangements with the daughters of kings and princes and governors of the surrounding nations. They were political alliances, basically, so that he could try to keep the peace with these nations around. But he also had 300 women that he just fancied in this sort of harem. He says pleasure proved to be meaningless. E. Stanley Jones was a great missionary to India. He was also a prolific writer. And in one of his books called Growing Spiritually, E. Stanley Jones spins the parable of a man who was searching for something to fill the void in his life. And God made a deal with him. God said, I'll give you anything you ask for. And so the first thing he asked for was a 15-bedroom, posh, immaculate mansion. And poof, just like that, there it was. 15-bedroom mansion with the finest accoutrements you can imagine. The man was pleased, and he said, well, I think I'd like the finest automobile that money can buy. Poof, there it was. The finest wheels you could drive. And he drove it all over town, and he felt special for a moment. But then it kind of left him empty, and he felt a little bit bored, actually. He said, I would like the finest cuisine prepared by the finest chef on the planet. And poof, there it was. The finest food to titillate his palate. He ate it. It tasted good for a moment, but then he felt that emptiness again, and he became bored. And then he said, I'd rather be in hell than here. to which one of the servants said, "Don't you know that's where you are?" So many people have found, like Solomon, that the pursuit of unbridled pleasure at the end simply leaves you with this vacuous feeling, this void that nothing on earth can seem to satisfy. Solomon said, it's really like chasing after the wind. But he also searched in the avenue not just of pleasure, but of power. Now remember, he has a position, a paycheck, and with his title comes enormous power. And now he's about to flex his muscle and show his power. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 4 reads, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. So he gets into all these building projects. He seems to be searching for something that can make him feel significant or meaningful, give his life a little bit of purpose. He actually built the temple in Jerusalem. It was one of the great wonders of the world. It took 7 years to build. The finest craftsmen worked on it. As I mentioned earlier, the cedar from Lebanon were inlaid in that temple. It had gold, all these silver and gold ornaments and accoutrements, and all the vessels that were related to worship in the temple. And that temple was known far and wide as Solomon's temple. And it lasted for almost 400 years until under King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians came and razed the temple. They tore it and utterly destroyed it in 586 BC. But Solomon then went from, after he completed the temple, he went to building things for himself. He actually built a palace, get this now, that was twice as large as the temple. This is just for himself now. You can see how narcissistic he has become. And it took twice as long, took 14 years to build, and it was over twice as costly. But then, in his depraved state, as he's looking to flex his muscle and his authority, he gets into slavery. He has slaves. Verse 7 reads, I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And if you dip into 1 Kings chapter 5, a wealth of biographical information, what you'll read there is actually staggering, at least it is to me. At its peak, at his peak, Solomon owned 183,300 slaves as conscripted labor. Pleasure, power. But there's another word, and that would be the word prosperity. Because really, that's what it's all about for him. He thinks there's got to be something at the end of this rainbow of prosperity. There's got to be a pot of gold there. There's got to be something to fill this void in my life. Verse 8, I amassed silver and gold for myself. Now, in case you missed it last week we talked about what his annual salary was. So let me tell you, based on the price of gold today, per ounce, Solomon's annual salary would be $1,213,665,730.95 a year. And that would put him pretty stinking high on the Forbes list of most wealthy people in the world. He had all the things money could buy. Not only everything he could ever need, everything he could ever want, but he discovers the sober truth as he actually declares in chapter 5, verse 10, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. Now let me ask you, if your income was over $1 billion a year, would you be satisfied? Oh, I know your answer. Oh, you say, of course, oh my goodness, I would love that. I would be so satisfied with that, and you really think you would. But what you might find is that if you suddenly had that, you'd probably want a little bit more. You'd probably want a little bit more because you'd hear about somebody else who has more than that. And Solomon concluded, this too is meaningless. But what's staggering to me about Solomon's life, as we're going to continue to learn throughout the series, is that he was a true Renaissance man. The breadth of knowledge he had was mind-boggling. Again, if we look at it and begin to see all the things he undertook, it is absolutely staggering. Verses 4 through 6 read, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. Again, if you go back and check 1 Kings, which is a rich source of information, you'll see that he actually gave lectures. Catch this. He was like a prof, a respected professor who lectured on everything from botany to zoology, to get this, ichthyology. He was enamored with fish for some reason. He studied them. He lectured on them. This enormous breadth of interest. I have no idea how he found time for it. He was one of the most interesting characters who's ever lived on the planet. But I'm struck that in the midst of all this, with all these things going on, he also gets interested in farming. Verse 7, I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And according to the record here, it tells about what the daily supply of food was for himself, for his family, for his court, and all of the people who kept all of this running. It's amazing. Solomon's daily provisions, 1 Kings 4 reads, his daily provisions were 30 cores of fine flour. That's about 3,000 kilograms. 60 cores of meal. That's close to 6,000 kilograms. 10 head of stall-fed cattle. They're fed with corn to fatten them. 20 head of pasture-fed cattle. And 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. A lot of hungry mouths to feed. A lot of people to take care of. And this is what it took daily to keep all of this going. But after summarizing his search in pleasure and power and prosperity, he concludes in verse 10, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. There's few people, by the way, that could honestly make that statement, I think. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet, and I want to underline the word yet about 14 times, yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. Now notice that phrase again. If you missed last week, that is a key to understanding where he's coming from in this book. 32 times that phrase, or the phrase under heaven, which I think is used synonymously with it, that's used 3 times, under heaven. It means life lived empirically. At the end of your nose, what you can experience and measure with your own senses. He's saying, if there is no God in the equation, no afterlife, no reward, then as far as I'm concerned, it's meaningless. It's like a chasing after the wind. I think this is a pretty sad and sordid autobiography. But let's turn a corner today. Let's just change the whole atmosphere in the room. We've looked at his pursuit and pleasure and power and prosperity. We've seen what he concluded about it. But now let's turn the corner, because quite frankly, we don't need to read a 3,000-year-old testimony, a little autobiography, to see people who are searching for meaning. Listen to tomorrow morning's talk show. The world is filled with stories like, oh, I'll change a few details. But you've got the same basic search for meaning. People looking for meaning in life apart from God. Ironically, by the way, it was Solomon himself who wrote in his earlier days, when he was thinking more clearly, in Proverbs 21, he who loves pleasure will become poor. Whoever loves wine and oil will never be rich. Also in the book of Proverbs, we read, O my son, O son of my womb, O son of my vows, do not spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings. What's the point? He knew better, but he was ignoring the wisdom he had. He had slipped back, and he's in pursuit of pleasure, power, prosperity. And he's saying, this better world I long for doesn't seem to exist. I got a question for you. Is pleasure, be careful before you answer this in your own mind, is pleasure in and of itself wrong? If you followed Jesus for a while, if you've read the Bible much at all, I really hope that you know the answer to that. Is pleasure in and of itself wrong? Psalm 16 reads like this. You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, says David, the psalmist, with eternal, catch this, eternal pleasures at your right hand. Obviously, pleasure in and of itself is not wrong. In fact, I want us all to understand, God is the creator. God is the author. God is the originator of pleasure. It's his idea. Often I'll hear, in a broken world like ours with so much pain, I'll hear people raise the age-old question, if God, you can fill in the rest, right? If God, why so much pain in the world? I think that's a wonderful question. And thankfully, there are some answers. But I got a better question. If no God, why so much pleasure in the world? We certainly have no logical reason to deduce that a purely naturalistic process without God in the equation could ever produce the enormous pleasure that so many of us humans experience on a regular basis. If no God, why so much pleasure in the world? God is the creator of pleasure. And pleasure in and of itself is not wrong. In fact, it's interesting to compare the two last verses we read, Psalm 16:11 and Proverbs 21:17. There are pleasures that make you poor, according to Proverbs 21, and there are pleasures that are a sign of blessedness, according to Psalm 16. Now, let me ask you a personal question now. Can you put yourself in Solomon's shoes in any kind of meaningful way? Oh, I know the details are different. But whoever you are, whatever your journey, man or woman, whatever your age may be, can you slip inside his shoes for one moment? Let's suppose that you had unlimited resources. You can live life without limits, as it were. You have access to the greatest sexual pleasures you can imagine. It's just all unlimited. You can have anything you want in life, make any pursuit you want. What would that do to you? Say, boy, I really wish I could try. I'll tell you that. I'd love to give it a try. You know what I think? I think for most of us, if we really had that, I think we might find ourselves thinking we should be the last person on earth to postpone pleasure and the last person on earth to embrace pain. In a word, my opinion is we would become entitled. We would start feeling like the rules don't apply to me. I'm special, I'm different, I'm unique. They don't apply to me. And so the mantra of Solomon's life becomes, as he expresses in chapter 8, so I commend the enjoyment of life, because nothing is better for a man under the sun. No God in the equation, no afterlife, no heaven, no hell, no reward. Nothing's better than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany him. Boy, doesn't that sound good. It sounds so idealistic. And yet Solomon himself discovers that the reality is very different. Yes, I'm actually going to read those verses again. I want to make sure we get what he concluded. After he denied himself nothing his eyes desired, he refused my heart no pleasure. He says, my heart took delight in all my work, and this is the reward for all my labor. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done, what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Hey, in the world of rock and roll, if you just throw the question out, I think to the average American or anyone in the Western world, what are the top 5 rock groups of all time? Wouldn't that be an interesting discussion? And you get a little debate going back and forth. Who should make that list? I think that most people would put the Rolling Stones in their top 5 rock groups of all time. Some years ago, there was a little documentary done on the Rolling Stones called Stones in Exile. They were in exile for a while, trying to escape some tax issues that were coming down on them. And the film told about all of the path of devastation that had been left behind. It spared no details. It showed all the good, the bad, the ugly. And after the film was released, Mick Jagger was interviewed, and he said, everyone's life comes to an end. We all die. We all have the same fate. But I think you should keep going while you can, doing whatever you like to do. And in the context of the interview, it was like, what about all the people along the way? What about all the pain? What about all the hurt? What about all the devastation set in motion? You say, look, this is going nowhere. But just to find out what you like to do, just do it. Because it's all going nowhere. The basis for 31 years for the Stones, who left in 1993, the one often called the quiet one or the silent one, Bill Wyman, was interviewed as well about his experience. And although he left in 93, rejoined for a reunion tour. Wyman said, and I quote, getting to the top was an exciting experience. It kept driving you, but when we arrived at the top, there was nothing there. It was empty. It's amazing how common that testimony is. Solomon would say, that's what I found. I've heard Billy Graham tell the story many times about the depressed man who went to see a psychologist. He just couldn't seem to get out of his deep depression. Life was just so sad and so sordid, and he just couldn't find joy anywhere. The psychologist was a true professional. He tried to help the man with attitudinal things. He tried to look into his past to see what the antecedents were for this miserable state. He tried to give him strategies for when he felt anxiety coming on or depression, how he could maybe deal with it more effectively. But nothing seemed to work. And finally, the psychologist remembered that the circus was in town. And he said, I know, the circus is in town. Go buy yourself a ticket to the circus and you go see, there's a clown in that circus and he is hilarious. I think he's the greatest clown in the world, the great Grimaldi. Many times when I've been a bit down, I've gone to watch that clown perform and he always delivers. He always puts a smile on my face. Go see that clown perform. The man was shaking his head. No. He said, I can't do that. I can't do that. The psychologist was a little miffed at this. He said, wait a minute, you come to me for my help. I'm telling you this will help you. And you won't do it. He said, I can't go see that clown perform, for you see, I am that clown. I am the great Grimaldi. And I think most of us know that the good life is a lot more than buying a ticket to the circus or finding a maid or having a fat financial portfolio or seeing your team win games. Solomon says all these pursuits without the Lord are meaningless. They're like chasing after the wind. But I want to close today by turning another corner and comparing Solomon's experience to another person who walked this earth some 2,000 years ago. Jesus Christ. What about this idea of pleasure? Well, Jesus was known as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He didn't leave the impression on his contemporaries that he was some hilarious character. And yet, he did tell many humorous stories to make a point. And we get the idea that he really knew how to have a good laugh and a good time with his friends and his disciples. But you know where he found pleasure? Jesus said that his pleasure was to do the will of his Father who had sent him. What about the area of power? Solomon searched in power. What about power? Jesus said after his death and resurrection, all authority, all power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. But during his life, he both taught and modeled that the greatest among you will be the servant of all. And if you want to find your life, you got to lose it for the sake of the gospel. What about prosperity? It's almost humorous. When it comes to prosperity, Jesus practiced downward mobility. He left the glories of heaven to be born in a stable and laid in a feeding trough for animals. The Son of Man has no place to lay his head, said Jesus. And yet, did Jesus live the abundant life? Oh my. He said, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I've come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. And he modeled that as he lived it out with his disciples. How could two stories be so different? I'll tell you how. Solomon's attitude was, I will deny myself no pleasure my eyes desire. It's all about me. That was his attitude. Jesus' attitude? I will do only what pleases the Father. Which of those characterizes your life today? Your answer to that is really important. God, thank you that we can learn from the ancient search of one called Solomon, which is just as contemporary and fresh as tomorrow morning's news. May we have eyes to see and ears to hear the lessons you want to teach us through this story. Father, I pray that these days, as we look through Ecclesiastes, would be amazing days of discovery, where so many are feeling like they're looking in a mirror. And may we get wisdom. And may we learn the true pleasure that comes from calling you Lord and seeking to please you. Father, today I ask that you would deal with those who are fearful, depressed, frustrated, yearning for so much more. I pray that today would be a turning point, a day when there's great revelation by your Spirit as you illuminate your word and drive it supernaturally home to every heart. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.